Welcome back. You know, in the span of only 60 years, three of the most popular 30 caliber cartridges were introduced in this country, and have probably overtaken the entire lot of 30 caliber cartridges ever made. On the popularity charts in terms of rifles being sold, and in cartridge popularity in terms of the actual cartridges being sold, these cartridges rank ahead of anybody else, way ahead of all other cartridges. We're talking the 308 Winchester, which was developed in 1952 to 53, and the 3006 Springfield, which is actually originally designed in 1903, and then it was modified by the military in 1906, and the 300 Winchester Magnum, which came out in 1963. Those three cartridges dominate the scene when it comes to 30 caliber sales in this country and probably throughout the world. So let's talk about those three and see where they fit into the spectrum. In reading all the blogs that I like to scan through, and just to put my thumb on the pulse of what people are thinking out there and what they're writing according to what they're saying themselves, I think there's a lot of misinformation. I think there's a need for a certain amount of disclosure that sometimes isn't given appropriately. And comparisons have to be made based on actual figures and not just myths and, you know, hyperbole. You can walk away with the wrong impression if you succumb to some of the information which is generated out there, especially by writers who sometimes don't know all the facts themselves, or sometimes they're distorting them simply to present a certain viewpoint for an article that they're writing. You know, if they're writing an article about presenting a particular cartridge that they like, they can distort the view in a political sense, which isn't necessarily realistic. Velocity has always been used to hype up a cartridge. Velocity sometimes can be misinterpreted and misappropriated by cartridge manufacturers simply to push a cartridge and sell it over another. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the public is a little bit more savvy than that. Let me just go back historically into a very classic example. In the early 50s, Winchester introduced the 243 Winchester, which was a necked down 308 cartridge. That had initially, it came out with a very good twist rate, which was able to spin a 100 grain bullet. So it was designed largely by Warren Page and Winchester, and they established a cartridge on the scene which went from varmints to big game up to the size, medium-sized game up to the size of deer, and it really developed some serious traction in a hurry. It became a very popular cartridge in all respects. Anybody who wanted to hunt, whether it's long range on varmints or deer up to 100 grain bullets, it was a fabulous performer, and it got into the market very solidly in a hurry. Remington, its arch competitor, came out with essentially the same bore diameter, but rather than being based on the 308 case, it was based on the 7mm Mauser case, and they released it as there's always a name game, and it's not necessarily the names don't mean anything, but it was called the 244 Remington, and the 244 Remington used exactly the same 243 diameter bullet as the 243 Winchester, but it could only handle bullets up to, because of its rather slow twist, it could only handle bullets up to about 90 grains, and 100 grain bullets simply did not stabilize. So their engineering of it was flawed from the outset. They didn't figure into the fact that most people who were buying the 243 were not buying it as a varmint cartridge, they were buying it as a deer cartridge, especially for their wives and for their youths, for their children. It was a fabulous cartridge for that. It had very little recoil, and it had extremely good takedown qualities, very, very long sectional density, ballistic coefficient and everything, and flying along at a muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second. It took deer home all the time. So Remington, you know, misread the market, and they promoted a cartridge which essentially was nothing more than a heavy-duty varmint cartridge, which, you know, this was the age of the 222, and people really couldn't care less about it. And you know, they didn't need to have a super varmint cartridge, and the few that needed a super varmint cartridge weren't too excited about it because it couldn't be used for deer. So the 244, shortly after it was introduced, Remington finally got on the stick, and they recognized they had to spin the twist a little bit faster and basically be able to put a 100-grain bullet in it. And in so doing, they now had a round which was not only competitive with the 243, but it was said to be even better because it could get out there another greater than 100 feet per second faster. So it broke that 3,000, that mythical 3,000 foot per second barrier. Well, one would think that 300 foot, that 3,000 foot per second barrier, just like the 253,000 back many years before, immediately sold all kinds of rifles. I guess Remington figured that was going to be, and all the writers thought that was going to settle the score, and the 243 was going to succumb to this new, the greater and better 6mm Remington. Well, the 6mm Remington now lies basically in the historic rubbish. It never caught hold. Once you have something that works, people aren't too interested in getting something that works better. It either works or it doesn't work. The 243 worked, and that was the one that everybody gravitated towards. The 6mm wasn't as user-friendly for, you know, the 7x57 cartridge case is a larger case, and it was not as comfortable to shoot for the wife or for the kids. So it didn't have any advantage. Anybody who was buying the 6mm Remington for an additional 100 feet per second, they were few and far between. So it really didn't have that advantage. So I digress. This is all about sometimes the velocity game, playing up feet per second in terms of you know, its sales potential. The 3006, when it came out, you know, had military numbers of like 2,750 feet per second or so, but in its commercial skin, these days it generates well in excess of 3,000 feet per second with a 150-grain bullet. Now I'm going to compare 150-grain bullets, not because I suggest that for any particular game, but simply because it's comparison factors, keeping apples to apples and oranges to oranges, you know, and comparing probably what's the most popular bullet weight for American deer hunters across the board, which is the 150-grain bullet weight for the 30 caliber bore. Again, I'm not saying that it's better. I'm just saying that's the one that when people go to the shelves, they reach and they buy 150-grain bullet weights because that's what their dads bought, that's what their grandfathers bought, and so forth. That's the one that they buy. But the 150-grain bullet weight in the 3006 runs around 3,000, 3,050 feet per second, generally speaking. Some of them more, but I'm not, you know, we're not here to discuss sales issues for different cartridges, but basically it's a 3,000 plus foot per second cartridge against in the typical rifle, the 308 is developing 2,900 plus feet per second, so like 2,950 to like 3,060 or something like that. So we're talking 100 to 110 feet per second in different differences of velocity. That velocity gain basically comes along with roughly 10 grains of powder increase. 10 grains of powder increase, when I say that, I'm saying that if you look in most of your loading manuals, and I'm not comparing what commercial cartridges load because they have their own loading powders and canister powders and things. But The 308 typically is running roughly between 47 to 52, 50, maybe 55 grains of powder. Sometimes 45, we'll say 45 to round off the numbers, between 45 to 55 grains of powder depending on its burning rate. The 3006 is running roughly 55 to 65 grains of powder depending on its burning rate. So you're running up the scale, and that's a sliding scale that moves along in all regards similarly. So the load that is developing a certain feet per second with the 308 at any given velocity, comparing it against the 3006, we're talking basically 10 grains difference. So that 10 grains difference, that gives you that additional 100 to 110 or so feet per second. In terms of actual range capability, when I say range capability, I'm not talking about its effective range on deer. Deer are not, I've said this so many times, deer do not present a difficult target for most bullets, especially any bullet in the 30 caliber realm. 30 caliber bullet is a big bullet. You know, you're talking about 6 millimeter diameter bullets at 2,900 feet per second, taking deer regularly all the time. You know, the 150 grain bullet traveling at 2,900 feet per second is a no-brainer. It's a bullet with far greater frontal area, and it's certainly got more than sufficient energy to penetrate through a deer in any direction that you point it. So we're not talking about we're not talking about effective energy. We're talking about simply the usable trajectory. So the usable trajectory is lengthened by the 3006 by roughly 25 yards, 20 to 25 yards. Or you could say that the 308's trajectory is less than the 3006 by 20 to 25 yards. And that's what you got. And when you're talking about using just a little bit extra holdover, that difference goes away very quickly also, because remember, they all are effective out as far as you could ever hit a deer. Those two bullets traveling at any speed is gonna bring a deer down. Keep in mind that the 3030 rather, with a 170 grain bullet, starting out at only 2,200 feet per second, which quickly sheds velocity because of its blunt, inefficient, low ballistic coefficient bullet. That bullet is sometimes striking deer at less than 1,900 feet per second, and it does a very, very adequate job. So you don't need to have an awful lot of velocity in order to kill deer. So we're talking about a difference of about 20 to 25 of overall range for the point blank hunter. In other words, the person who sights in his cartridge, sights in his rifle, so that it rises no more than a certain amount or drops no more than a certain amount. And that amount is up to you, whether it's 6 inches or 3 inches or 2 inches. But in any case whatsoever, the difference between the two cartridges is roughly less than 25 or so yards. So comparing on that scale, so they're both very good. I would consider both of them to be more than adequate for deer. They're substantial for deer. They're ample for deer. They're ample times 2. You don't have a killing issue with any 30 caliber cartridge of that sort. I really laugh when I see people say, well, that's the 308 is an underpowered cartridge. The 308 is not an underpowered cartridge. It's a military cartridge that has got more than sufficient capability to take down a simple deer that weighs 150 pounds or so. Even if it weighs 250 pounds, there's no issue. Now, let's talk about something which is a little bit more close to home for the average person. If you're equipping a rifle which is roughly an 8-pound rifle, it can be more or less depending on the sling they put on it, the size of the scope, the weight of the mounts, the weight of the barrel, so forth and so on. But if if you're picking yourself out of a nice, pump action rifle, or a lightweight bolt action rifle, and putting a scope on it, moderate power, either 1 to 5 or 2 to 7 or 2.5 to 8 or something like that, you're talking about an 8-pound rifle with a sling, roughly. Well, if you take those two rifles and compare the head to head for the additional power that you get from the 30-06 over the 308. The 30-06, I should say the 308, with that combination at 2,900 plus feet per second, you're generating somewhere around 13 pounds of recoil energy against your shoulder. 13 pounds of recoil energy is what 13 to 14 is about, depending on the amount of powder which is put in the cartridge by the manufacturer. That's the amount of recoil that you are feeling against your shoulder. If you go to a 30-06 with exactly the same bullet weight, you're jumping from 13 to 14 to roughly 19 to 20 foot-pounds of free recoil. That's a substantial amount. The 30-06 has typically been categorized over the years as being the most that the average person is willing to tolerate on a regular basis. In other words, we're not talking about taking a once in a while taking a wowzer shot with a 458 and saying, well, I shot it. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the amount of recoil that the average person is willing to tolerate for an afternoon of standing out in the field and shooting at water jugs at 200 yards away or something. The 30-06 it's about the ceiling for the average person of average weight and stature. It's probably far more, in my experience, it's far more than most women would ever wish to tolerate. It's well beyond that. The 308 is a gun which my wife was always able to shoot very nicely, even with 165 grain bullets, without any difficulty with her 760 Remington pump. Never bothered her in the least. But I can tell you that the 30-06 she would never get near. She fired the 30-06 a couple of times, and that was more than enough times. She did pretty well with her 270 Winchester, and the 270 Winchester, as a comparison, with a 130 grain bullet, was kicking out roughly 18 foot-pounds of recoil. Now that shows you how dramatic 1 foot-pound of energy is in a rifle, because she was able to tolerate basically 18 foot-pounds of recoil energy from her Seiko 270 with 130 grain bullets, but the 150 grain bullets out of the 30-06 being just another 1.5 pounds or so more was something beyond her limitations. So that shows you how sensitive those additional foot-pounds of recoil energy are. So consider that in terms of your selecting cartridges, or I should say rifles, one over the other, especially when you're dealing with bullet weights in that realm. If somebody would have asked me what would I recommend the 30-06 or the 308 when it comes to deer, I would have to say simply the 30-06 is absolutely unnecessary for deer. It's a waste of powder if you're a hand loader. It's more recoil than you certainly need to put up with. Is it more than I can handle? No, I've certainly handled a lot more recoil than that. But you can always shoot a gun with less recoil far more accurately and precisely than the one that your inner brain back here is anticipating recoil. I don't care who you are. There's brain cells there that are at work that are anticipating recoil, and that anticipation gets in the way of your concentration. So I would always recommend the gun that delivers 13 pounds of recoil over the gun that developed 19 pounds of recoil. We're talking like a 68% change in recoil from one to the other, which is nothing to sneeze at. Now, if you're talking about and again, the difference in actual trajectory it's less than 25 yards. So when does that become an issue? It may not become an issue for you at all, because the average deer hunter, if you're a white-tailed deer hunter, you're never taking shots that would get anywhere near the maximum point-blank trajectory of either one of those cartridges. It's as simple as that. If you're talking about hunting out west, and you're talking about occasionally shooting mule deer, if you're going from the eastern woods to the western plains, and you want to use the same gun and the same cartridge on both, then I would go to the 30-06, because that additional 25 yards of range can be meaningful out there. Sometimes that 25 yards can put the animal within the range of your gun, and while the 308 may not be in that situation. But then that opens up a whole can of worms, because then I'd have to say, well, I'd recommend the 270 or something a little bit more efficient for open plains game that has a better ballistic coefficient than the short, stubby 150 grain bullet. A 150 grain 30 caliber bullet is kind of short and stubby with a very low ballistic coefficient. Its ballistic coefficient in the PowerPoint bullet is only 0.294. That's, the PowerPoint bullet is not the most ballistically efficient bullet ever made, but still, that gives you an idea. It's very, very low on the totem pole when it comes to ballistic efficiency. 130 grain bullet in a 270, for instance, is far more ballistic efficient. Now, we've spoken about the difference between the 30-06 and the 308 when it comes to 150 grain bullets, but that's not where the 30-06 shines. If I put them both together side by side, you can immediately see they're both exactly the same case head diameter. They were both designed, basically they mimic the case diameter of its originator, the 7x57 Mauser, Spanish Mauser. That cartridge case, in all ways, shape, and forms, is identical to the 7x57 Mauser, just lengthened a little bit. So the 7x57 Mauser case falls midway between the 308 case and the 30-06 case. Other than that, they're identical in all ways. Now, that difference in length is of no concern when you're talking about a cartridge which is shooting 150 grain bullets, because both cartridges can easily handle the 150 grain loads. The difference arises when you start loading longer bullet weights. Now here's I can find the ones that I'm looking for. Here's a 165 grain bullet in, this is a nozzle petition. Now if I load, this is loaded to a very, very short overall length. This happens to be a cartridge that was actually loaded in 1953, just about the time when they were first introduced in this country to the commercial world. This 308, I've got a box, it's an antique box that goes back to 1953, according to the copyright label on the flap. Now, it's loaded to a lower overall length because this is only a 110 grain varmint bullet. But if I loaded it to its full, typical overall length, this 165 grain bullet would protrude down about halfway into this case shoulder. And remember now, the case capacity is generally expected to be somewhere around the shoulder itself. That's the typical case capacity, is the shoulder, notwithstanding the fact you can compress loads and all that stuff. But we're talking about a cartridge which is filled to capacity, generally speaking, at the shoulder. So the 165 grain bullet will not protrude down into the case capacity. The 180 grain bullet will fill the shoulder. It'll go down into the shoulder region when it's at the standard overall length, and that's about it before it starts bottoming out into the powder chamber. Here's a 200 grain bullet. A 200 grain bullet simply cannot be loaded into a 308 case without substantially intruding on the powder chamber, in the powder capacity. Well, what does that mean? It's very simple. The powder capacity of that case is measured to the shoulder. If you start getting down below the shoulder, you're immediately taking up the powder space that generates the pressure that will get that bullet going. So you start losing efficiency. You can always load 200 grain bullets in a 308. It's going to work, but you're going to be comparing it against a 3006 rather. The 3006 can handle 220 grain bullets and arrive at the same velocity that the 308 will shoot 180 grain bullets. It's as simple as that. The 3006 case, by comparison, has, let me show you the two again, side by side. If you look, starting from the lengths of from the top of the shoulder, going up to the top of the neck, you can see how the 3006 case is quite a bit. It's markedly longer. Well, that gives it a huge advantage. This case was originally designed to handle bullets up to 220 grain by the military. That's why it has such this long, luxurious neck length, is because of that need to handle long, the original loadings in the 1903 version of the 3006, which used 220 grain bullets. So it has this long neck that can handle 200 grainers without going down into 220 grainers without going down into the boiler room. This is a 200 grain nozzle petition. As you can see, it only goes halfway down into the shoulder. So it basically, as the 308 handles 165 grain bullets going halfway down the shoulder, the 3006 is handling 200 grain bullets going halfway down the shoulder, and where the 308 is taking 180 grain bullets going down to the boiler room, down to the chamber of the case, the 3006 is taking 220 grain bullets going down into the virtual chamber of the case. So this is where this is what cuts one out of the pack from the other. It's when you start increasing bullet weights. So the comparison for the person who's desiring one rifle and comparing it to another is basically asking yourself, what bullet weights are you looking at? Are you looking at shooting bullet weights from 180 grain down to say 110 grain bullet weights, or in that region? Then the 308 is got all that you need. When you have a cartridge that you desire to shoot greater than 180 grain bullet weights, 180 to 220 grain bullet weights, and to keep the velocities up, now you're talking about where the 3006 lives and breathes. And that's the classic difference between those two cartridges. And the 3006 is also equipped with typically 1 in 10 twist barrels, which is suited especially for shooting heavyweight, long bullets, whereas the 308 is equipped typically with 1 in 12 twist barrels. Sometimes a little sometimes a little bit slower, like 1 in 13. But typically the 1 in 12 twist is the traditional for the 308 for the lighter weight bullets. Both will handle bullets all the way from 110 to 200 or so grains, but you're certainly not going to be able to get any oomph out of a 308 when you're loading 200 grain bullets out of it. So that's the comparison between the two, and those are the real numbers. So you got to be really focused on what your desires are for a rifle. You know, when you up the ante and go from basically a short length action to a long action, you're increasing the weight of your gun, and perhaps unnecessarily. If you need to increase the weight of the gun because you want to have heavier bullets, that's fine. But if you're increasing the weight of your gun by an additional half a pound, that could easily go into the sling that you're carrying around with you and things like that. All these things should come into consideration. Keep that in mind. So let's go up to the next level here. This is where we're not only talking a longer powder chamber, but we're talking about a substantially broader powder chamber. In other words, this is that 7x57 Mauser case that has been lengthened. This is an entirely different case. This case right here originally started out as the 300 Holland & Holland. That was the original design. That was the original head diameter of the 300 Winchester Magnum. It's a different case diameter, and therefore it effectively gives it much greater powder capacity. How much greater powder capacity? We're talking 25 grains. We're talking about going up from 60 grains to 85.5 grains. That's a huge amount of powder increase. The difference is a tremendous 370 feet per second if you compare the factory ballistics of, say, Winchester 150 grain power point Super X loads. 370 feet per second is a huge amount of increase in velocity. Now, and it also substantially changes its energy coefficient. I'll say categorically that's of absolutely no consequence whatsoever to the deer hunter. The deer hunter, no deer will ever complain about the difference in velocity or energy. 150 grain bullet is really, it's a very poor choice for the 300 Winchester Magnum. You're talking about developing over 3290 feet per second with factory loads. 3290 is an explosive velocity when it strikes tissue. At most ranges, by the time that bullet strikes even way out there at 280 or 350 yards, you're still you're clobbering that deer at extremely high velocities. Now, that 370 feet per second, one would imagine that 370 feet per second would translate to a significantly longer range of cartridge. Well, it really doesn't. Not in terms that many people would expect. Remember, we're talking about ballistic sales points here. To raise the level of velocity up 370 feet per second sounds like a huge difference in terms of ballistic effect. Well, the terms of ballistic effect for the same exact bullet coefficient, comparing 150 grain bullets in the 30-06 to the 150 grain bullets in the 300 Winchester Magnum, or if you're comparing 180 grain bullets, if you're comparing bullets of the same ballistic coefficient and the same shape, the actual difference in actual trajectory and point blank trajectory is only 110 yards or so, 100 to 110 yards. That's a lot. 110 yards is a lot if you're shooting at game out on the plains, and you know the difference between having a cartridge which basically tops out at 300 yards versus a cartridge that tops out at 400 yards can mean the difference between bringing home game that day. But if you're not shooting at 300 to 400 yards, it's a moot point. It's of no concern whatsoever. And again, I say that you don't shoot deer with 300 Winchester Magnums and have much to take home if you're shooting them at 3,290 feet per second muzzle velocity. With 150 grain bullets, it's just simply too fast. They act like a varmint bullet, even the heaviest bullets. This is where, as I said, with the 30-06, the 30-06 comes into its own with the heavier bullets, such as the case with the 300 Winchester Magnum. The 300 Winchester Magnum, it suffers theoretically with a very short neck. The neck of a 300 Winchester Magnum is it's almost like the 300 Savage in terms of its short, squat neck. It's not quite as short as the 300 Savage, but it's not as long as most designers would have liked if they could just have any length action. But when this cartridge was developed, Winchester's goal was to be able to put this cartridge into a standard length action without having a long, what they call an extra long action, such as some of the Holland cartridges needed. So they wanted to be able to use, the same overall length. If you look between the 30-06 and the 300 Winchester Magnum, it's the same, roughly the same overall length. So they can be fired in a standard length action, and that was what predicated this short neck, was because they wanted to fill this boiler room capacity up as far as they could with as gentle a taper as they possibly could manage, and still have good extraction and feeding. So they maximized everything within the potential of that case head diameter, and so they arrived at this. And even though the theoretical length of that case neck is not as long as many people would like it to be, it turns out to be one of the most accurate cartridges that was ever designed. It's among the top tier accuracy cartridges ever designed. Not that somebody wants to sit at a bench all day and shoot it as an accuracy cartridge, but it's a very, very efficient cartridge. Now, because it has such a huge amount of case capacity, it also has a little bit more fudge room to be able to put heavier bullets into it. So you can load its classic elk bullet weight. It tends to be the 180. That's what it seems. Most people tend to pick the 180 grain bullet for elk, and it does a very nice job. Myself, I prefer the longer 200 grain bullet, and even though it gets down into the boiler room somewhat, this case capacity is so big, it effectively doesn't really do much damage to the velocity. My load, if I can recall offhand, my load with that 200 grain bullet with my Seiko was running around 2,950 feet per second. It was running with a 200 grain bullet. I was running as fast as a 308 does with a 150 grain bullet. So it was a very, very stellar performer on elk. I don't want to have anybody think that I am diminishing any cartridge of the three from the other. If I had three thumbs, I'd give three thumbs up. They're all fabulous cartridges, and they deserve the place that they hold in our firearms world. In the 30 caliber bore size, they all excel in their own particular usage. There is no difference in bore diameter between them. They all shoot 308 diameter bullets. It's just a matter of how fast they shoot them and the weights that they can handle, the amount of bullet weight that they can handle. So that's what basically sets one apart from the other. If you're an elk hunter, you can't do any better than the 300 Winchester Magnum for elk. There are cartridges that you can get that are bigger bore, that will do more substantial damage. You can get a 338 Winchester Magnum and things like that. You can shoot 8mm bullets. You can go on and discuss these issues at length, but a 300 Winchester Magnum will drop an elk as handily as any cartridge out there with the appropriate bullet, and with ample energy, not just sufficient energy, but ample energy. Remember that many elk are taken every single year with 270s with 150 grain bullets, and some people even use 130 grain bullets that are appropriately sized. So there's no loss whatsoever of efficiency or capacity when it comes to that sort of usage for moose or for anything. I consider 30 caliber, most people most experienced hunters, and I've never gone after dangerous bear, but myself, I don't have that kind of money to throw at it. But if I were going after large bear, I would take the advice of most guides who would in those regions who would recommend heavier bore diameter. It's not the speed that drops those big guys, from what I understand. It's the bone busting capacity, the amount capability of really cracking large bone tissue and destroying the animal's ability to run after you. So those are the big issues. But in all other regards, I would consider the 300 to be more than substantial for any kind of game in America. It's probably one of the very, very best cartridges for long-range shots on elk up to 350 even 400 yards. I simply do not take shots beyond 400 yards. There's absolutely no need to. You can always get yourself a little closer, and I think that you're simply risking too much because wind can veer a bullet off, and missing the game is that's no issue at all. If you miss, you miss. But if you happen to shoot a hole through his intestines, he's going to run for miles before he finally collapses. He's going to die without bleeding very much, and so you've lost an elk, a valuable game animal is lost to America. But so I dismiss anybody shooting elk beyond 350 to 400 yards, and I don't encourage that sport. I think it's foolhardy, and I think it causes a lot of unnecessary waste. I see it all the time on YouTube. I really think it's ethically irresponsible. But the 300 is a fabulous cartridge for that particular usage. The 30-06 still stands as probably the supreme cartridge when it comes down to all measurements. The 30-06 really stands as being one of the most venerated cartridges for all-purpose uses. You know, the guy who has a 30-06 is very well equipped for anything on the U.S. continent. He can handle anything. It's not as long-range shooting as a 270. It's not as long-range shooting as a 7mm Magnum or any of those, but it will certainly handle any of the same game as far and actually farther in many cases. It has substantial bullet weights. It has terrific frontal area. It's a stellar performer in all regards. It's a little bit less than the 300 Winchester Magnum for those super long shots where you need to drive in deep, but it's not substantially less. You know, you're still talking only a difference of 100 yards of point-blank trajectory, but the energy factor really is of no consequence, because the 200 grain or 180 grain bullet out of a 30-06 is going to take your game down, no matter what it is. The 308 is probably over capacity for the average deer hunter. You don't really need to have a 30 caliber bore to take down deer, but it's certainly a great cartridge for you know, the reason why the 308 has stood the march of time so well is the same as all other military cartridges. It just simply is available. You can always get 308s. If you go into the big box stores that sell guns, they always have 30-06s and 308s on the shelf. It's just, you know, they have 3 or 4 calibers in those big stores, and those are the ones they always have: the 308, the 30-06, and maybe a couple of others. The 7mm Mag and the 300. Those are the ones they always sell. They're the very popular ones. So, you know, if you have a need for a heavy-hitting deer cartridge that you don't have to worry about, you know, shooting through twigs on occasion, there's nothing better than a 308 for that sort of usage. So I give my hats off to the designers of each of these 3 cartridges. The 308, which has been around now since 1952 to 53. The 30-06 has been around essentially since 1903, and the 300 Winchester Magnum that has been around since 1963. All great cartridges. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe. God bless.